I want you to understand something before I start. I am not a stupid man. I spent 38 years designing infrastructure bridges, tunnels, drainage systems that still carry the weight of thousands of people every single day. I understood load calculations. I understood failure points. I understood that every structure has a breaking point if you push it hard enough. And yet I stood at a roulette table in Manila at 2 a.m, watching a croupier rake away the last of my dignity, and I thought just one more spin. I thought that right up until there was nothing left to spin. That is what I want you to understand before I tell you the rest. Not that I was naive, not that I was careless. I was neither of those things. I was something more dangerous than both. I was certain, and certainty, in a casino, is the most expensive mistake a man can make. My name is Marcel Fontaine. I am 71 years old. I was born in Lyon, trained as an engineer in Paris, and spent my career at a firm that built some of the most reliable drainage and transport infrastructure in southern France. I'm proud of that work. It was precise, disciplined, and lasting. When I retired 4 years ago, I had a pension, a modest investment portfolio, and savings that totaled, across all accounts, approximately £475,000. That number represents 38 years of careful decisions. Meals I did not eat out, holidays I shortened, a second car I never bought. That number was the physical proof that I had lived responsibly, that I had planned well, that I was prepared for the years ahead. That number is gone, every pound of it, and I am going to tell you exactly how it happened because I think if I do not say it plainly, out loud, to someone, I may spend the rest of my life in the comfortable fog of almost understanding it. I arrived in Manila on the 4th of October, 2 years ago. I had chosen the Philippines after a long conversation with my colleague Pierre, who had retired there 3 years before me. Pierre is a cheerful, practical man who had spent a decade talking about his dream of living somewhere warm after a lifetime of gray Parisian winters. He had chosen Manila, specifically the Makati district, and his letters and messages from there were full of a contentment I found genuinely appealing. He talked about the open friendliness of the people, the extraordinary food, the low cost of maintaining a comfortable life, the way the city moved at a pace that did not demand anything of you. He said, more than once, that for the first time in his adult life he felt like he had permission to simply exist without producing anything. That appealed to me more than I admitted at the time. I had been alone for 12 years, since my divorce from Sylvie. The divorce was not dramatic, no betrayal, no explosion. We simply became two very different people who had started out as the same person, and the distance between us became too wide and too permanent to bridge. Our daughter Camille stayed in Lyon. I kept the Paris apartment. I worked a great deal, and when I finally stopped working, I discovered that work had been filling a space I did not know was otherwise empty. Retirement arrived, and the silence in that apartment was absolute. Pierre's descriptions of Manila felt, in that silence, like an invitation. I booked a room at a hotel in Makati, nothing extravagant, clean and well located for a 2-week stay, intending to explore before committing to anything longer. My intentions were entirely ordinary. I wanted warmth. I wanted to understand whether Pierre's contentment was genuine or the cheerful exaggeration of a man who had committed too publicly to a decision to admit its limitations. I wanted to walk around a city that was not Paris and eat food that was not what I always ate and sleep in a way that felt like rest rather than the performance of rest. On my 3rd evening there, the concierge mentioned, in the pleasant, helpful way of hotel staff who have said the same thing 1,000 times, that many guests enjoyed spending an evening at the casino attached to the hotel complex. I thanked him and went back to my room, but I went the following evening. Not because I was interested in gambling, I genuinely was not at that point, but because I was tired of sitting alone in a comfortable room watching French cable television in a country that was not France. The casino had atmosphere. It had people. It had the ambient noise of human activity that an empty hotel room thoroughly lacks. I went in for a drink and to watch, and that was all. The room was large and beautifully managed. The lighting was amber, that particular warm dim that casino designers use, and which I now understand has been specifically calibrated to make you feel relaxed and unthreatened while simultaneously making it impossible to track the passage of time. The tables were busy but not frantic. The sound was layered chips, cards, the mechanical rotation of roulette wheels, the low murmur of conversations conducted in half a dozen languages. I sat at the bar with a gin and tonic and I watched. I watched the way a man who has spent his career observing load behaviors watches anything, looking for the patterns, looking for the system, looking for where the pressure accumulates and where it releases. That is when Evangeline Soto sat down beside me. She did not appear in the way people appear in films, no dramatic entrance, no pause for effect. She simply materialized in the seat to my left and ordered sparkling water from the bartender with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged in that room in a way that the rest of us merely aspired to. She was in her mid-30s, I judged, dressed professionally, composed, with an alertness in her eyes that reminded me, oddly, of the best junior engineers I had worked with over my career. People who were always thinking one step ahead of the conversation, always processing what was not being said alongside what was. Her English was precise and thoughtful. She introduced herself without ceremony as a casino host, as if that were a perfectly ordinary thing to be, which I suppose in that room it was. "You look like you are observing rather than playing," she said. It was not a question. "I am an engineer," I said. "Observing is a professional habit." She smiled. "Then you probably already know the mathematics are against you. That is why I am at the bar." She laughed. It was a real laugh, quick and unperformed, and it surprised me because I had not expected authenticity in that particular room. We talked for perhaps 30 minutes. She asked about my career, about Paris, about what had brought me to Manila. She listened in a way that I had forgotten people could listen, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually receiving what I was saying, turning it over, responding to it with questions that proved she had heard the previous answer. She seemed, for lack of a more precise word, genuinely interested. And for a man who had been largely invisible for 12 years, eating alone, working late, moving through a city that had long since stopped noticing him, that quality of attention was a more effective intoxicant than anything behind the bar. Before I left that evening, she said something I have returned to many times since. She said, "The people who lose consistently in places like this are people who play with emotion, boredom, excitement, desperation. Someone with a genuinely analytical mind plays differently. The odds are still against them, but the gap is smaller." She paused, and then added, almost as an afterthought, "Not many people have the discipline for that approach. Most people think they do. They don't." I told her I had no interest in gambling. She said, "I know. That is why I think you might be different from most people here." And then she excused herself professionally and went back to her work, and I sat with my empty gin and tonic glass and felt, for the first time in a long time, like someone had actually noticed me. Not politely, not out of professional obligation, actually noticed. I went back the next evening, and the evening after that. Within the first 2 weeks, Evangeline Soto was the most consistent fixture in my Manila life. We would speak at the bar, sometimes for an hour, sometimes more. She was unfailingly professional. There was nothing overtly personal in the way she engaged with me, nothing that crossed a visible line, but the cumulative effect of her attention was deeply personal. She remembered everything. That I took coffee without sugar, that I preferred to sit facing the main floor rather than the wall, that I had mentioned a particular book about the mathematics of probability, which she then referenced again, with precision, a week later in a relevant context. She created, through the sheer consistency and quality of her attention, a version of our interactions that felt like friendship. Perhaps it was. I have spent a long time trying to decide whether friendship can exist between two people when only one of them is being fully honest. She began explaining the games to me during our conversations, not in the way a dealer explains them mechanically, defensively, at a professional remove, but with genuine intellectual engagement. She talked about baccarat not as a game of chance, but as a study in human psychology played out across green felt. She talked about blackjack as a system with a specific mathematical structure that rewarded a certain kind of patient decision-making rather than impulsive reaction. She talked about poker as something close to engineering reading forces, calculating probabilities, managing multiple variables simultaneously under conditions of imperfect information. She talked about all of it as if it were a discipline that genuinely required intelligence and precision, and she talked about it that way in conversations with me specifically, as if she were explaining something to someone who was capable of understanding it at that level. And she said, more than once and always in passing, always as if she were simply noting an objective fact rather than making a suggestion, that an analytical mind was genuinely better suited to this environment than an emotional one. I placed my first bet on the 8th day, £200, converted to pesos, on a baccarat hand. I won. The physical sensation of it was something I had not expected and have never quite been able to fully describe, a jolt of something electric and warm that passed through my chest and left me very awake, very present, very alive in a way I had not felt since the last day of a major project completion some years before. Evangeline was at my shoulder and she touched my arm briefly, only for a moment, and said, "You read the table exactly right." I knew, at some level I was already beginning to suppress, that I had read nothing. I had placed a bet and the probability had gone in my favor, which it does roughly half the time in that particular game. But the way she said it, with that particular tone of someone confirming something they already believed, made it feel like skill, and I wanted it to be skill. That wanting is the thing I have to take responsibility for completely, even now. Over the following 3 weeks, I played perhaps 15 more sessions. The wins and losses balanced reasonably closely in those early weeks, which I now understand is a feature rather than an accident. Early wins and approximate balance create the neural pattern of intermittent reinforcement that drives addictive behavior more effectively than consistent winning would. But I did not think about it that way then. Then I thought about it as evidence, as early data from a methodology that was still being calibrated. Evangeline was present throughout, and she managed her presence with what I now understand was professional precision, more visible, more engaged, more warmly encouraging during the wins, briefly supportive and analytically framed during the losses. When I won, she spoke about methodology and instinct and the particular quality of my approach. When I lost, she spoke about variance and patience, and the long-term view that distinguished serious players from casual ones. She never once said, "This is ultimately a game of chance, and the house wins in aggregate." She never said, "You should think carefully about whether this is the right use of your retirement savings." She said the things that kept me at the table, and she said them in a way that sounded like wisdom rather than management. That was her skill. It was considerable. I moved into a serviced apartment at the end of October. This was primarily an economic decision. A longer-term rental was considerably more sensible than extending the hotel stay indefinitely, but it also reflected a decision I had not formally made but had quietly already made. I was staying in Manila. The city had grown on me in ways I had not anticipated. The warmth, both the climate and, genuinely, the people was everything Pierre had described. I had discovered a small restaurant near my apartment where the food was extraordinary and the owner knew my usual order within a week. I had walked the bay at dusk several times and felt something approaching the peace I had come looking for, and the casino and the conversations with Evangeline had become the structure around which my days organized themselves. I had purpose again. I had somewhere to go. I had someone who appeared genuinely glad when I arrived. For a man who had retired into absolute solitude, these things carry more weight than they should. By December, my net losses at the tables were approximately £14,000. I thought of this as the cost of entertainment. I had spent comparable amounts on a skiing holiday in the Alps some years back without a second thought. I told myself this was the same category of expenditure: leisure, experience, the reasonable cost of enjoying one's retirement in a way appropriate to the circumstances. I told myself this with the full confidence of a man who had not yet begun to understand what he was inside of. The water, at this point, was still warm. I had not yet noticed that it was slowly coming to the boil. Evangeline raised the subject of the VIP room in December. She did it carefully, the way she did everything, not as a pitch, not with any visible commercial pressure, but as a piece of information she thought I might find relevant to consider. She explained that the VIP room had higher minimum bets, but also significantly higher table limits, which was actually advantageous for a player with a real methodology because you could place meaningful bets during genuinely favorable conditions rather than being artificially constrained by lower limits at the regular tables. She said, in the same careful, factual tone she used for everything, that my level of analysis deserved a bigger stage. She said it once and did not repeat it. She did not need to repeat it. I heard it precisely as she intended me to hear it. The first time I entered the VIP room, I felt the shift physically in the atmosphere, the temperature, the quality of attention from the staff. It was quieter, more focused, lit slightly differently. The people at the tables were older and better dressed and more contained in their reactions, the kind of controlled expression that serious money teaches. Evangeline escorted me in with the ease of someone who belonged there, and I felt, walking beside her through that door, that I belonged there too. I placed a bet of £3,000, more than I had ever placed in a single bet in my life, and I won. Standing at that table with the chips moving toward me, I felt something I have since identified, through reading and through therapy, as the specific euphoria of the early addiction phase. The total, glowing, physical certainty that I had arrived somewhere I was meant to be. Evangeline said nothing, just looked at me with something that read as quiet pride, and the silence was somehow more effective than any words. By February, my total net losses were approaching £38,000. The wins had quietly and steadily fallen behind the losses, and the gap was widening week by week in the way that things widen when you are too close to them to see the trend. But I had internalized Evangeline's framing so completely by this point that I was describing this to myself, internally, as a variance phase. I am an engineer. Engineers understand variance. Structures experience at periods of stress and load that do not reflect their fundamental integrity or ultimate performance. I was in a stress phase. The mathematics would correct in time. I needed to maintain my methodology and resist the emotional response of panic, and so I increased my average bet size. This is the gambler's fallacy dressed in the clothing of rational analysis, and I have since read enough about compulsive gambling to understand precisely what was occurring in my brain during those months. That understanding does not make it less humiliating. It makes it, if anything, more so. In March, Evangeline told me about a private poker room the casino was establishing for a selected membership of guests. The membership fee was £15,000. She presented this information in the same way she presented everything factual, considered, without visible pressure, offered as information rather than as a sale. She explained that the player selection process was rigorous, which reduced the emotional volatility at the table, which in turn created an environment that rewarded disciplined analytical play over pure luck and aggression. She noted that she had recommended me for consideration. She said it quietly and with what appeared to be genuine conviction, and I felt it the way she intended me to feel it, as recognition, as evidence that someone with real expertise saw something in me worth recommending. I wrote the transfer that evening. I did not think about it overnight. I did not call anyone for a second opinion. I transferred the money and felt, in the doing of it, like I was making a serious decision rather than an expensive mistake. The poker room was the place where the real destruction began, and it began the moment I sat down at the table. I need to be honest with you about this. I am not a poker player. I had learned the rules. Evangeline had spent considerable time across our many conversations, explaining strategy, position play, pot odds, reading opponents. I had read 2 books on the subject and watched a significant amount of instructional video content in the weeks before the room opened. But reading about poker and playing poker against people who have spent decades making their living by reading other people across a table, these are as similar as reading about surgery and performing surgery. The other players in that room understood what I was within the first hand. Not my name, not my history. What I was, a new player, late in life, with more money than experience and more pride than awareness of my own limitations. They did not say this. They were perfectly courteous men. They simply took my money with the quiet, efficient patience of people who do this not for need but for pleasure, and who are very, very good at it. In my first 2 months at that table, I lost 22,000 pounds. Evangeline attended some of these sessions. She would watch from a position slightly removed. She was working, after all, and the room had other guests, but she was present in the way she was always present, attentively, at the right distance. After poor sessions, she would find me at the bar and she would find the right words. She talked about learning curves in poker being longer and steeper than in other games. She talked about the patience that distinguishes long-term success from short-term variance. She talked about specific hands I had played and found the element in each one that could be framed as a correct decision that had gone against me for reasons of chance rather than judgment. She was extremely good at this. Every word she said was technically defensible. Every word she said was practically designed to keep me in that room. And I listened because I needed to listen, because the alternative accepting that I was simply not good at this and had spent a great deal of money discovering that fact was not something I was yet able to do. I want to tell you about a specific evening in March before I tell you about Jeff, because I think it is important that you understand not just what I lost, but what I was feeling during the losing. There was a night in the 3rd week of March when I won 19,000 pounds in a single baccarat session. I want you to sit with that number for a moment the way I sat with it that night. 19,000 pounds. In an evening. I had placed a series of large bets, and the probability had, for once, moved with me, rather than against me. And by the time I stood up from that table, the chips in front of me represented more money than most people earn in 6 months. Evangeline was there for the final hand. She said nothing. She simply looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as confirmation, as if something she had always believed had just been proven. I walked out of that room that night feeling like a different person. I felt, I am ashamed to tell you, invincible. Not in an arrogant way, or at least not in a way that felt arrogant from the inside. More in the way that a structure feels when the load calculations are exactly right, balanced, precise, entirely in control. I called Pierre that night. Not to tell him about the gambling, I still could not do that, but simply to hear a familiar voice, because the wind had cracked open a loneliness I had been managing by keeping myself busy at the tables. Pierre sounded glad to hear from me. He talked about his garden, about a fishing trip he had taken the previous weekend, about the particular quality of light over Manila Bay at dusk. I listened and I smiled into the phone, and I said nothing about where I had just come from or what I had just won or how much of it I was about to lose back in the weeks that followed. Because I lost all of it. Every pound of the 19,000 pounds, and more besides, across the next 6 weeks. The win became, as I now understand is almost universally the case, not a turning point but an escalation point. I increased my bets because the win had proved my methodology. I pushed harder in the poker room because the win had proved my analytical edge. I believed, with the specific certainty of someone who has just received powerful evidence, that I was operating correctly and that the recovery of the larger losses was simply a matter of continuing to operate correctly and allowing the mathematics to do what they were supposed to do. The 19,000 pounds win was, in retrospect, the single most expensive thing that happened to me during those 18 months. It kept me in the room for another 6 weeks that cost me far more than any single loss had cost me alone. In April, I met a man named Jeff at the VIP bar. British, former investment banker, mid-60s, and carrying the particular physical weight of someone who had been sleeping badly for a long time. We had drinks together after a session in which we had both lost considerably. The way two strangers sometimes talk honestly to each other in airports and on long train journeys, the anonymity of shared bad luck creating a temporary permission for truth. He said something to me after his second whiskey that I received and immediately rejected. He leaned close and said, in a voice pitched below the ambient sound of the room, "She's extraordinarily good at what she does, isn't she?" He did not say Evangeline's name. He did not have to. I told him I did not know who he meant. He looked at me for a long moment with an expression that contained no judgment, only the resigned tiredness of someone who has already made the decision I had not yet made. And then he said, "No, of course not. Forget it." He settled his bill and left. I saw him once more, 2 days later, checking out of the hotel with his luggage. I never saw him again. I told myself he was a bitter man, looking for someone to blame for his own choices. He had seen something I was not ready to see, and I turned away from it and went back to the table. Evangeline loaned me money in April. £10,000, informally, transferred through a simple arrangement she presented as the most natural thing between friends, a bridge facility, she called it, until my next investment matured. She said she trusted me completely. She said the repayment timeline was entirely flexible. She said it with the warmth of genuine generosity, and I received it that way because I needed to receive it that way. I went to the tables and lost most of it within a week. My daughter Camille called in May. She lives in Lyon with her husband and my 2 grandchildren, and she had been calling periodically since I left Paris, checking in the way that adult children do when a parent retires abroad and they are not entirely certain the decision was wise. She asked how I was getting on. I told her Manila was wonderful, warm, interesting, full of life. She asked if I had made friends. I said yes, some. She sounded relieved, which produced in me a specific and complicated guilt that I buried the way I had learned to bury everything that year, quickly, without examining it, and immediately. When I hung up, I looked at my banking applications for the first time in a month without flinching from what I saw. The net loss at that point was £165,000. I looked at the number for perhaps 2 minutes. Then I closed the app. Then I went back to the casino. By August, the total was £230,000. I had begun liquidating investment holdings. I did this through online banking at unusual hours early morning, 4 or 5 a.m., when the sky over Manila was beginning to lighten and the city had not yet started, and I discovered that shame has a particular quality at that hour of the morning. It is very clear and very cold and completely unambiguous. The transfers happened through a few careful clicks, the kind of interface that makes large financial decisions feel technically simple, and each one felt like a small internal collapse that I immediately filled in with the cement of the next plan, the next session, the next turn of fortune that Evangeline had told me was coming. She loaned me another £18,000 in August. She brought the transfer documentation to the casino herself and handed it to me quietly, in the way of someone doing a friend a favor rather than conducting a transaction, and she looked at me with what I read as investment in me, in my potential, in the turn that she appeared genuinely to believe was imminent. I understand now, with the clarity that only comes from a very long distance, that I was most likely an asset to her in a professional sense that had nothing to do with affection. A guest spending at my level generated significant commission. My continued presence justified her position and her influence in that room. Keeping me engaged and spending was professionally valuable to her in ways that existed entirely separately from whatever she might or might not have felt about me as a person. I do not know whether she thought of what she was doing as harm. I have thought about this extensively, and I genuinely believe she would be surprised to be described that way. That is perhaps the most unsettling thing about the entire 18 months. Pierre sent me a message in September asking why I had gone so quiet. I had been avoiding his calls for 2 months. Pierre knew me well enough that if he asked the right questions, I would not have good answers, and I was not yet prepared to have no good answers. I sent him a brief reply explaining I was deep in a personal project. He accepted this because Pierre is a decent man who takes people at their word. I exploited his decency in order to maintain an isolation that was, by September, more or less complete. Pierre sent me a message in September asking why I had gone so quiet. I had been avoiding his calls for 2 months. Pierre knew me well enough that if he asked the right questions, I would not have good answers, and I was not yet prepared to have no good answers. I sent him a brief reply explaining I was deep in a personal project. He accepted this because Pierre is a decent man who takes people at their word. I exploited his decency in order to maintain an isolation that was, by September, more or less complete. I want to tell you what that isolation felt like, because I think it is important, and I think it is something that nobody who hasn't been inside this kind of thing fully understands from the outside. The isolation was not something that was done to me. I built it, carefully and deliberately, one avoided call at a time. I told myself it was temporary, that I would reconnect with everyone once the losses had turned, once I had something to report that was not a disaster, once the story had a better second half. I told myself that explaining what had happened would require explaining everything, and explaining everything would mean admitting to people who respected me that I had become something I would not have respected in anyone else. A man who gambled, a man who borrowed from a woman he barely knew, a man who had watched his retirement savings drain into a casino floor and continued, for reasons he could not quite articulate, to go back and offer more. The isolation protected the secret, but the secret was not protecting me. The secret was the thing that was most keeping me in that room, because the room was the only place where the secret did not exist. Inside the casino there was no shame. There was only the next hand, the next session, the next turn of probability that would begin to set things right. Outside the casino, in the apartment, on the phone with Camille, in the messages from Pierre, there was only the full weight of what I had done and was still doing. The casino was, in that terrible way, a relief. That is the thing about addiction, that no one who has not experienced it can quite believe. The harmful thing becomes the refuge from the harm it is causing. The first real window of clarity came on a September evening on my balcony at perhaps 2 a.m. The heat was still substantial even at that hour, and the city below was in its particular nighttime configuration of lights and sound. I had opened all 3 banking applications. I had added the figures on a piece of hotel notepad paper in my engineer's handwriting, precise, habitual, and I had sat with the total without immediately explaining it away. The number was £290,000. I sat with it for perhaps 20 minutes. I did not tell myself it was temporary. I did not project the recovery session that would begin to reverse it. I simply looked at it and let it be what it was. And then I went to bed. And in the morning I went back to the casino. Because the only thing more unbearable than accepting that number was accepting it and doing nothing, ending the story at that point, with that loss, for nothing. If I kept playing, the loss was still a situation in progress, still a problem being actively worked on by an intelligent man with a sound methodology. Stopping meant it was finished and real. I could not make it finished and real. Not yet. Evangeline found me at the bar after that September session and said, with the particular quiet confidence she brought to everything, that she could feel I was close to the turn. I asked what she meant by that. She said, "Players have cycles, like structures do. You have been under maximum load. But structures do not fail at the point of greatest stress. They fail when the load shifts suddenly and they are not prepared. You are prepared. You are very close." She used my language. She used the language of my profession with precision and deliberateness, and I heard it in my bones, the way you hear things spoken in the language you think in, and I went home that night believing her completely. That is the part I find most painful to sit with, even now. Not the money, the believing. By November, I had lost £380,000. The real clarity came on a Tuesday evening in November, at the poker table, during the 4th hour of a session in which I was already down £8,000 for that night alone. The man across from me was Korean, perhaps 30 years old, and he played with a stillness and precision that I recognized, at some level below conscious thought, as the quality of someone who had been doing this for a very long time. He took a significant pot from me with the quiet efficiency of someone removing a nail from a wall cleanly, without drama, with no particular interest in the emotional dimension of what had just occurred. I looked at my remaining chips. I looked at the room. The amber light was exactly as it had always been. The sounds were exactly as they had always been. Evangeline was across the room, 20 feet away, speaking to another guest, her posture as composed and attentive as it had been on the first evening at the bar. And I watched her and I felt, moving through me from somewhere above and outside, the cold, specific understanding of what I was looking at. I was looking at a system, a very well-designed, very precisely operated system, running through human beings the way any good system runs through its components, making use of each part's particular properties to produce the desired outcome. Evangeline was the interface, the part of the system that I experienced as a person, that I had allowed myself to relate to as a person, that I had, somewhere in the 18 months, come to need as a person. But she was also a professional in a role that had very specific objectives, and those objectives were mine only to the extent that a casino's objectives are ever aligned with its guests. The house edge is not personal. The casino host is not personal. The amber light and the chips and the table and the cards and the intermittent winds that kept me returning, none of it was personal. It was a machine, a very good machine, and I had been inside it, believing myself to be a special case, for 18 months. I cashed out what remained of my chips. I said goodnight to the dealer and I left without speaking to Evangeline. I walked back to my apartment through the Manila night, which was warm and smelled of traffic and night-blooming flowers and the planters outside the hotel, and I sat on the balcony and I let the silence in. Not the planning silence, not the calculating silence, just the actual silence of a man who has finally stopped lying to himself about where he is. I did not go back for 3 weeks. When I returned, it was for one purpose. I found Evangeline on the afternoon floor, where the room was quieter and the light from the windows competed slightly with the amber of the ceiling. She saw me and her expression arranged itself into the same composed welcome it always had. I asked to speak with her privately. We moved to a corner of the floor, away from the tables, and I stood and looked at her for a moment before I spoke. She waited. She was always patient. I told her I was leaving Manila. She said she hoped it was not because of the games. I told her I was leaving because I had spent 18 months learning something I should have already known. She asked what that was. I said, that understanding the mathematics of something and being immune to it are two entirely different things. She nodded, slowly, the way you nod when someone says something that is true. She said she hoped I would find peace in Paris. She said Manila would miss me. She smiled the careful, measured smile that I had, at various points across the preceding months, interpreted as warmth, as professional courtesy, as affection, and which I now looked at with the clear vision of a man who has finally stopped deciding what he wants to see. I looked at her and I understood, without anger, without hatred, with something closer to a profound and exhausted clarity, that she was going to walk back onto that floor and begin this same careful process with the next man who sat down at the bar and told her he was an engineer who did not gamble. I flew home in the second week of December. The flight was 14 hours and I had a window seat and I looked at the South China Sea below for a long time as we left the Philippine coast behind. I am not a sentimental man by nature. My profession selected against sentimentality in ways I was grateful for, but sitting at that altitude, looking at that water, I felt something that I could only describe as grief. Not for the money, for the 18 months, for the man I had been during them. He had been so certain. He had been so unwilling to hear what every instrument was clearly telling him. He had been, in the end, the specific kind of proud that engineers spend careers learning to distrust, the pride that says the failure cannot be here. In this calculation, in this design, in this man, because this man knows what he is doing. That pride, in a structure, produces catastrophic failure at the worst possible moment. In me it had produced a slightly slower disaster, extended across 18 months by the professional management of a woman who understood exactly which levers to pull. Camille met me at Charles de Gaulle. She looked at me with the expression that a child reserves for a parent who has clearly been through something significant and has not yet explained it. She held me for a long time at the arrivals gate and said nothing. I let her. The flight had been 14 hours and I had spent most of it looking at the seat back in front of me and composing, in my head, the words I would have to find. I told her the following week at her kitchen table in Lyon, while the grandchildren were at school. I laid out my banking statements on the table. I told her about Evangeline, the bar, the VIP room, the private poker room, the loans, the things I had told myself in the 4 a.m. hours and chosen not to hear. I told her about the image of myself that Evangeline had held up for me, the analytical player, the disciplined mind, the man whose professional background gave him a genuine edge, and how much I had loved that image, and how holding on to it had cost me everything I had saved. I told her about Jeff and what he had said and how I had turned away from it. I told her about Pierre and the months of avoided calls. I told her everything, plainly, without editing, the way a structural report is written with complete fidelity to what the data shows, even when the data shows failure. Camille cried. I did not cry. I had done that privately, alone, in the week since the balcony in November. She asked if she should be angry at Evangeline. I said it was more complicated than anger. She asked, very quietly, the question that good daughters ask when they genuinely need to understand rather than simply to express their distress. Papa, how did this happen to you? And I told her the truth, which is the only ending this story has. It happened because I wanted it to. I wanted to feel alive in a way that retirement had made difficult. I wanted to feel like I was good at something new, something that my professional background equipped me for in ways it did not equip ordinary men, because I was not ready to be an ordinary man in an ordinary retirement. I wanted to feel seen by someone who paid genuine, detailed, remembering attention, because I had been invisible for a long time, and invisibility, after a certain point, becomes its own kind of pain. And a very skilled professional identified exactly what I wanted and built, around me, an environment in which I could pursue those wants with complete conviction for 18 months, until the money ran out. She was very good at that. I say this without euphemism. It was a remarkable professional performance. I am back in Paris. I rent a small apartment in the 14th arrondissement. My pension is adequate. The investment portfolio that was meant to supplement it does not exist any longer. The apartment I had intended to purchase outright is beyond me now. I see a therapist every 2 weeks, a precise, practical woman who uses words like compulsive gambling and exploitation and emotional dependency without ceremony and without excessive compassion, which is what I need. She has helped me understand that what happened in Manila had a structure as identifiable as anything I ever built. A carefully engineered environment designed to produce specific behaviors in specific kinds of people, optimized by long practice and real intelligence. Knowing this is useful. It does not return the £475,000. Nothing returns the £475,000. But it removes some of the specific corrosive shame of believing that what happened to me is uniquely explained by something uniquely deficient in me. It is not uniquely deficient. It is profoundly human. The pride that made me susceptible. The loneliness that made me receptive. The need to be exceptional that made me willing to stay long past when the evidence was already clear. These are not rare qualities. They are the specific qualities that a system of this kind is designed to find and use. If you are listening to this and you are somewhere I have been in that amber light, at that bar, talking to a woman who makes you feel like the most interesting person in the room, please hear me. The house does not care about your profession. It does not care that you understand probability theory, that you have a methodical mind, that you have spent your career making decisions that required genuine precision and discipline. The house has been optimized over decades and by very intelligent people to take money from exactly the kind of person who believes his intelligence makes him different. The confidence is the vulnerability. The certainty is the opening. And the woman who tells you that you play differently from other people, that your analytical background gives you an edge, that she has watched a lot of players and she can see something in you that most of them lack. She may be entirely sincere in that moment, or she may not be. Either way, the outcome is the same. And if she also makes you feel seen, if she remembers the small things, if she listens the way almost no one listens, if her attention makes you feel, for the first time in years, like you are visible and specific and worth someone's genuine interest, please understand that I know exactly what that feels like. I know how much it costs to be lonely. I know how powerful it is to suddenly not be. But that quality of attention in that environment is a professional instrument. It is not a personal gift. And confusing the two is the most expensive mistake available to a man in my position. I left Manila with the clothes I arrived with and a knowledge of myself that I did not have before. I am 71 years old and I am learning, for the first time with any real honesty, what I actually need and what I am actually willing to do to get it and what I am not. That is something. It is not 475,000 pounds, but it is something, and it is mine, and no one took it from me. If you are at a table right now, any table, anywhere, get up. Walk out of the amber light and into whatever the real evening looks like. The real evening is imperfect and offers no guaranteed wins. But it is the only place any of us can actually afford to live. My name is Marcel Fontaine. I was a structural engineer for 38 years. I lost 475,000 pounds in 18 months in a casino in Manila. I am still standing. And that, just that, only that, nothing more is enough.